Okay. I like to end on verse 10. Love never wrongs one's neighbor, and thus love is the complete fulfillment of the law. We have been misled basically by Lutheran ideas that the law is legalistic and that the Jews depended on a legalistic because that's what Martin Luther's experience was with the Catholic Church. But it was not Paul's experience nor Paul's teaching. He saw, and he said it, and we've read it as we study Romans, that the law was good. In the famous chapter, the 7th chapter, where he talks about the law was good, but in me I didn't find any good thing. I wanted to follow it, but I couldn't. And so he says here that the law actually is based on love. That's it. Read it. Love never wrongs one's neighbor, and thus love is the fulfillment of the law. That might help us understand what Jesus meant when he said, I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill it. And what is he? He is he who loves everyone and benefits everyone. So there was plenty wrong with the Jewish people. There is really more than adequate evidence that they never obeyed the whole law at any time in their history. Why should that surprise you when Peter, when they had the council in Jerusalem in Acts 15, says, why should we bind on the Gentiles what we have never been able to keep? And so there is where law brings death. It's not because the law is bad, it's because the law is good, and we can't measure up to it.
One thing that helps, I think, capture the spirit of how they regarded law is to understand that the law was the instruction of God, which was found in the Scriptures.
Yes. And
so our understanding of how we appreciate the Scriptures is how they appreciate the law.
That's exactly right. And so what the great failure of the couple of generations of Jews, maybe 3, in the early days of Christianity, was that they refused to see that the law and the prophets pointed to Jesus as the Messiah. That's what changed Paul. He was an opponent of Jesus. He viewed him from a human standpoint, and he was a crucified criminal. That's what it looked like to the Jews. And when that proved to be false, Paul had to have, it was a complete surprise to him. He didn't just gradually get disgusted with the law and look for something better. He was right up to the moment the bright light flashed and the voice said, "Why are you persecuting me?" He was thoroughly convinced Christ was an imposter until his nose was rubbed in the reality. And it was such a shock to him that he fell down and was blind and didn't eat or drink anything for 3 days and nights. That's a shock. And he didn't know what to do about it until Ananias came and told him. So don't swallow that idea that the law was so bad that Paul spiritually hungered for something better. He thought the law was the end all, be all about serving God. He saw the law as loving. He saw the law as inculcating good relationship with God and with fellow man. But he, as I said, the shock to him was that Jesus Christ was risen from the dead, and therefore he was the Messiah of the Jews.
He does say that, and that Christ said, "Why are you kicking against the goads?" Like there were starting to be some doubts, because I think of the witness he was seeing.
Well, no,
people who were
yeah, the goads were things that God had allowed him to be exposed to that should have already changed him.
Mm-hmm. Like Stephen.
Yeah, Stephen. That really is probably the primary one. Okay. That's it. Now the approach of the day of Christ, and this is where we were when we stopped last week. We've only had 15 minutes of class till we get back to where we were. All right. Carry out these injunctions because you know the crisis we are now in. Now, I can be wrong, but I think it's a really defensible position to see that crisis as the beginning of the persecution of the Christians by the Roman Empire. Only 7 years later, Paul was beheaded and Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. So surely there was enough evidence around that Paul could sense this. He didn't know exactly what was going to happen. God didn't ever reveal too much of the future to Paul, except the distant future, the final day of the Lord. God did reveal much to him about that. So I am 99% sure that that's what he's talking about.
What was that date, Charles?
What?
What was that date?
When
the persecution began?
Well, Paul and Peter were executed in 64 AD.
Okay.
And if this book were written, which it most probably is, in 57, that's just 7 years.
Okay.
In other words, that would be like, this is 2014, and the great persecution was going to begin in 7 years, 2021. And anybody sensitive to what was going on could see the increasing hostility that was coming. And so he said, this is more important. I used the illustration last week, and I want to come back to it. We ought to behave as if we were in a lifeboat. That's, you remember, how many of you remember the motion picture, Lifeboat?
Are you talking about the one from Alfred Hitchcock?
What?
Lifeboat from Alfred Hitchcock. That was survivors of a ship that had been torpedoed by the Germans during World War II.
Yes, uh-huh.
And how they survived.
Yeah, it was in black and white, and it was just, I think, about the time that, say 1940, 41, something like that was when it was. I can remember it was a great movie. And if you're in a lifeboat, one thing that is going to be completely destructive is if you've got some hatred and people that's out for their own good, and that will mean that the whole boat can be, they can be sunk, they can be fighting, they can be killing. And so Paul is having that same thing. I want that image of being in a lifeboat. I think that's more telling than, say, on an uninhabited island. Although, how many of you know about the history of the Bounty crew that mutinied and finally ended up on Pitcairn's Island?
Some of it, I don't know. Yeah, some of it, how it ended up.
Well,
Their society degraded.
in 15 years later, when a British Navy frigate came to Pitcairn's Island, there wasn't a single one of the mutineers alive. They killed each other. They all kinds of things. They slaughtered the local people. They behaved because they were completely lawless. And that goes back to the beginning of the 13th chapter about what it's like when you have no civil government at all. It was every man for himself, and the devil take the hindermost. And that Paul is saying Christian morality and Christian ethical stances are exactly opposite from that. Christians help one another. They do not hinder. Christians support one another. They're not in it for themselves. They're in it for the corporate unity, the body of Christ. And that is something that is really needed in every period of the history of the church, is that we stick together. What was it Benjamin Franklin said? We must all hang together, or most surely we'll all hang separately. And that's exactly what Paul is talking about. And by the way, historically speaking, it was Christian hospitality that helped the church survive the enmity of the Roman government.
What was it that turned Rome against the church? Was it because they didn't honor Caesar as God?
Because, yes, that's basically it. Rome was always suspicious of new religions. They let the Jews practice their religion because it was an old religion. And at first, Rome and its officials did not make a distinction because most of the believers were Jews, and they just saw it as an outgrowth of Judaism. But as it became more and more apparent that it was a new religion, that was the first reason they did. And then after about the time of Nero, they really started emphasizing the worship of the deified dead emperors. It started started with Augustus. After he had been dead for several years, they built a temple to his genius. It's called, and that's spirit or essence. And then wasn't much longer till they started deifying the living emperor. And the way they tested this, and that was one way they kept the Roman peace, was they had used the worship of the emperor as a religious political tool. And so they saw the Christians as rebels against the peace. See, one reason Paul always talks about peace, peace that passes understanding, the peace of God, that was a direct slap at the Roman government claim of being the pacifiers, the peacemakers of the world. And there was the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And it was pretty well peace. Although, as somebody pointed out, it was peace like peace in the graveyard. That if you did rebel, they'd kill you. And so that they got rid, and that the Christians got sucked into that socio-political, religio-socio-political battle on the wrong side as far as Rome was concerned. Okay, it is high time for you to wake up from your sleep, for our salvation is closer now than the hour we first believed. Now, I could not translate that, because there's a book called The Hour We First Believed. That's a very common phrase. It has gotten in even to the literary circle. What?
There's a song, that phrase.
Uh-huh.
Amazing Grace.
Yeah. Yes. But there is a novel too. I think it won a Pulitzer or a Nobel Prize or something. But now, the word salvation. This is one of those words, Lindia, that has been preacherized. Now,
Not plagiarized?
well, no, but you ask the average believer, what does being saved mean? And they would say, coming into a relationship with God. Individual salvation. I hate to quote N.T. Wright all the time, but he has really helped me understand Paul. The word salvation, when Paul uses it, never means coming into a relationship with Christ. It always means salvation from death. That is, resurrection.
To life.
What?
To life.
To life, yes. And that for Paul is, so what he's saying is that every day brings you closer to your resurrection. And that's a truism. Now, where it's here, in this context, it means that you may, and it may have this thrust about it, if it is, as I think, the persecution of the empire-wide persecution of Christians, there were people that he wrote this to whose salvation was imminent, including, guess who? Paul. Because our resurrection, I don't know exactly how to put this, the sooner we die, the sooner we're raised, I guess is to get blunt. We talk about our existence in the intermediate state. And I'm not criticizing anything that Randy said in his series on that. But if we go into the presence of Christ, which is pretty clear we do. If we live with Christ, we die with Christ. He now exists in a timeless state. And so it may be 1,000 years, I don't know, maybe 1,000,000 years. You know the old joke about the man who was talking to God, and he says, "Is it true, God, that a minute is as 1,000 years, and or 1,000,000 years, and 1,000,000 years is in a moment?" And that, so he said, "Okay, I want $1 million." And God said, "Just a minute." Do you get the point there? So,
All in his time.
in fact, we can only think in the terms that Randy preached in, because we cannot comprehend timelessness. Anytime there's a physical body, and I'm not talking about a human body, just time only has meaning where material particles exist. So the Big Bang started time. There was no time until God said, "Let there be light." And light already was. And so it's always going to be confusing to us. But Paul wanted them to realize that they were in this lifeboat, and they only had so long. In the original lifeboat movie, they just had so much water and so much food. And that is, I'm using that as a symbol that we only have so much time. And we ought to live every day as if tomorrow we were going to be judged according to the deeds done in our body. That's getting right down to the nitty-gritty on the road. We ought to live, I think, and I'm much more aware of this than when I was younger. I have come to terms with it and feel quite peaceful about it. But mine and I will joke a little bit, you know, something is going to happen 5 years from now. What's the odds that either one of us will be here 5 years from now? I know my primary care physician said she couldn't see any reason why I didn't live to be 95, but she's not in this body of mine. Her body is much younger. And when I wake up in the morning, I'm not sure I want this body of mine. But eventually most of the parts get to working. But it's there. And I don't want to be morbid about it. There was the old time revivalist preachers who, you know, they tried to scare the hell out of people, as the old saying is. And they would paint great pictures of the torments of hell. And but the problem is, if that's not the gospel. The gospel is a gospel of love. And if you're scared into something, what happens when you get away from that moment and it's not so scary anymore? Love abides. Love is a permanent commitment to the well-being of other people and even the well-being of ourselves. And so it lasts. I never thought I would live as long as I have. I can remember thinking that if I lived to the year 2000, when I was 72, that I would be lucky. And here I am, 86, and still going. Not strong, but still going. But we need to think about these things. If you are not, and if I am not, I'm going to put it personally, if I am not prepared to die, I am not yet prepared to live. And that's kind of what Paul is saying here. Live in the light of eternity. Live against the backdrop of the fact that our salvation, our resurrection from the dead, is closer today than it was when we first believed. It's very practical. It's not something esoteric. One thing that I always tried when I was active minister and giving the eulogy or the message or whatever it's called in funerals was that we all owe God a death. Death is just as sure as we were born. And so what we need to learn is how to live so that we will know salvation, our resurrection from the dead. And one thing that I've enjoyed about translating is translating both Jesus' words and Paul's words about the sureness of the hope I have. It has enabled me to really accept my mortality and not feel that little thrill of anxiety when I think about it. I used to read the obituary page and then see how old the people were that died. Now, I don't read the obituary page except to see how old, you know, our local newspaper has one obituary on the obituary page of somebody who has lived a long and successful life. Then it's got a list of other people, and I think I look at them and I say, oh, they died 5 years older than me, or I'm 5 years older than them, and it's a kind of a game. It no longer scares me, and I can visualize. I don't think I'm probably be important enough to get the #1 rating there, but and
Charles, to illustrate from the lesson this morning, would you say you are more intimate with Christ today than you were because of increased study of the
yes, I thought about that as he was preaching. I am. I take it. I don't know how to put it, but in actually looking at every word and trying to use an English equivalent that will cause the same emotional, psychological and spiritual reaction in modern readers. I have absorbed enough that I can almost know what's the next thing he's going to say. He's become extremely real to me, as Paul has. Every once in a while I say, I surprise myself and I say, this man actually lived. This man actually said that. And I begin to think about being present in one of the crowds, in one of the private sessions. I see an ebb and flow in his life where he was in the public eye until he wore himself out, and he would retire to a private place and commune with his Father and have his strength renewed. And I know that because I've always felt exhausted after I teach a class or preach a sermon, because I put myself into it. I'm working at the highest level. It's like running as fast as you can, but doing it mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. I want to put everything I've got into it. Jesus put everything he had. We think of him healing just, kind of casually. But we have the woman who touched the hem of his garment, and he said, power went out of me. He paid a price. Even before he was on the cross, the people wore him out. They exhausted him. And that's, I can understand that. And it makes him real. He walked and he talked, he was tired, he was hungry. He sweated. He was cold. He got so physically tired one time that he lay down in a ship and put his head on the ballast bag of hard-packed sand. He went sound asleep, and the storm didn't wake him up till the fear of the apostles did. He did that. The wind blew. The rain wet him. That's the kind of relationship that I get in doing that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Let's go on. The night is far spent. The day is at hand. Now, the day. And you notice I capitalized it? Any time that it says the day or that day in the New Testament and even in the Old Testament, it means the day that the Lord will intervene. Now, it's like the Antichrist. John told us there were many antichrists. And it means anybody that opposes Christ. But there is the Antichrist. Somebody who will be released at the end time. Now, I don't want to put too much emphasis on that, but come to my Revelation class, we'll learn more about that. But just that day, remember in Hebrews where it says, don't forsake of the assembling of yourselves together, as some have the habit of. but exhort one another to good works, encourage one another and exhort one. Eat as much as you see the day approaching. And it means, again, this mentality of being in a lifeboat. That's, I want that, I hope that you never read these scriptures again without thinking about a small lifeboat and realize that that person across the dinner table, the person beside you in the bed, the children when they come home from school, they're all in that lifeboat together. And you need to treat them, to love them, to work with them as you would if you were in a lifeboat out in the middle of the ocean.
Charles, you're saying that this is the day of his intervention.
Mm-hmm.
Would that include, for the people of Israel, crossing the Red Sea, the leading out of the people from Egypt, these things where God demonstrated
Okay.
himself?
Let me give a bit more clear definition. The day is the time when God intervenes in such a way as to change the course of history.
So not necessarily just a day of judgment in the future.
But the day that you capitalized here is his final intervention, and he's going to change the course of history. He's going to do it by creating what?
A new heaven and new earth.
A new heaven and a new earth. Couldn't be any greater change in history, because this heaven and this earth are flawed and they're running down. And the new heaven and the new earth will not be that way. It will last forever.
Such as the influence that Satan has had on this present creation.
Yes. Okay, let's go ahead.
It will no longer.
Divest ourselves of the works of darkness. Now, Paul, this was one of Paul's favorite figures of speech, was putting on and taking off of clothes. And think about it. Anybody that's been baptized into Christ has put on Christ in Galatians. And he talks in 1 Corinthians 5 about putting off this fleshly body and putting on a new body. It's a metaphor for Paul that means more than just changing clothes. Although changing clothes can make you look entirely different. If you think about it, and this is a great figure of speech. And so he says, look, put off the works of darkness. That is, you know, so much of sinful public behavior takes place at night. If you watch any television, you know that sometimes I wish they'd make them a little brighter. I can't see in the night. But the works of darkness. Darkness, remember what Adam and Eve did when God came down in the cool of the evening after they had eaten of the fruit? They went out into it says, you know, the underbrush, the darkness, the shadows.
The hiding.
The hiding. That somebody, it was, I can't think of his name now, really great preacher up in Dallas. It won't come. He said, Adam hid and hurled. he hurled rocks at Eve and God. He said, the woman you gave me caused me to eat of that. You talk about passing the buck, that's passing it down. But Eve was just as good at it as he was. Eve said, the snake made me do it. Harvey Cox, man, was teaching at the divinity school at Harvard when I attended. Man, I did not have a great deal of respect for him, but he did have a book called On Not Leaving It to the Snake. It's about assuming responsibility for our own actions. He says, let us put on the armor of light. Now, think about this. Here you are back in the Middle Ages, and you get up in the morning, and then the king sends down, I need my soldiers. And so you take off your outer clothes and you put on shining armor. Or if you're the Black Knight, you put on black armor. And you look completely different. You know, I'm not very prepossessing in my physical size and all, but let me put on a full body armor and get a sword as long as I am, I'd be a different person. And again, this is one of Paul's metaphors. Remember in Ephesians, he says, he talks about putting on the whole armor of God with the shield and the sword, which is the word, the Spirit, and so on. And so this goes back to a theme. And that theme is that since Christ died for us, our choices are effective. If we're without Christ, it makes very little difference what we choose, because we will always be sinners separated from God. But now that we've been incorporated into the body of Christ, our decisions change us. That's what our young brother Hawkins was talking about this morning, about choices that change us. Choices to be intimate with Christ, to be knowledgeable about the Word, to be with other people who have faith. The choices we have, and that's what he's talking about. He says, choose what kind of garment you're going to wear. I like to have color coordinated. And I this morning, I picked this out last night. And somebody asked me, you know, did Mina buy my clothes? No, I buy them myself. She consults with me about color coordination. It's just, you're either born with it or you're not. Our daughter that lives with us, is even better than I am about it. I consult her sometimes because she's got really good taste that way. But here I am. This was deliberate, because I wanted to present myself, as I've told people, I don't want to be a sloppy old man. I see so many of them that their shirt tail is out, they haven't shaved in 2 or 3 days, and I don't like that half-shaved look that men do today. Anyway, let us live honestly in the day, not in wild parties and drunkenness, not in promiscuous sexual intercourse and debauchery, not in jealousy and fighting. Now, you notice this is a typical Paul's listing of the two ways of living. He sounds a lot like in the 5th chapter of Galatians, where he talks about the works of the flesh and the works of the Spirit. And notice he puts jealousy and fighting right along in the same list as drunken parties, promiscuous sexuality, and debauchery. That we have a different rating. We think sexual sins somehow are worse than others. The worst sin of all is not to love. I had a friend who was a member of this congregation years ago who had been a prostitute in her younger days. I was surprised when she shared that with me, but she had been. But she was, you would not know it today. I think she is probably still alive. She's younger than I am. But there's no way you can figure out who she was. If there had been, I wouldn't have used her as an example. But she made a choice, and she put on Christ, and it changed who she was. That's what these choices are about. Our time is just about up, and since Felicia isn't here today, I'll take over her job. But again, remember the lifeboat. If you don't get anything else out of today but that, it will be very beneficial to you. Wake up in the morning thinking, I'm in the lifeboat with the people that I will be contacting today. As you go about the day, think about, I'm in the lifeboat with this person, this group of people. I need to behave like being in the lifeboat.